My mother hung up on me at 6:04 on Christmas Eve. At 9:11, a nurse called and asked if I was her next of kin. 3 hours. That's all the space there was between the woman who wouldn't speak to me and the woman who, in a hospital bed 40 miles away, had apparently written my name down as the person to call if she died. I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of it. I did not expect that phone call. Not the hang-up. I'd had 10 Christmases of hang-ups by then, 10 years of a dial tone where a mother's voice should be. But the second call, the one from the county hospital, that one broke something open in me that I didn't know was still closed. I remember standing in my kitchen in my socks, the turkey I hadn't cooked for anyone still frozen solid in the sink, and a woman with a calm, practiced voice was telling me that my mother, Eleanor, had listed me, the daughter she hadn't said a real sentence to since 2016, as her emergency contact, her next of kin. If you have ever had to fight your way back into a family that decided you didn't belong in it anymore, I think you already know the particular kind of dread that phone call put in my chest. Stay with me, because this isn't a story about a sick old woman and a daughter who came running. It's a story about what 10 years of silence had been hiding, and about a sister who was very, very sure I would never find out. My name is Claire. That Christmas Eve, I was 46 years old, and I had not seen my mother's face in person. Not across a table, not in a doorway, not once, in 10 years. The last time I heard her voice before that final hang-up, she had called me, unprompted, at 6 o'clock, the way she used to when I was a little girl and dinner was ready. I remember thinking, foolishly, hopefully, that maybe this was the year. Maybe 10 years was long enough for whatever had broken between us to have worn itself down to something softer. "Mom?" I'd said, and my voice actually shook saying it. There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard her breathing, thin and careful, the way she breathed when she was working herself up to something. "Renata's here," she said finally. Not hello. Not Merry Christmas. Just my sister's name, like a door closing. "I have to go, Claire." "Mom, wait!" The line went dead. 6:04. I checked the clock out of some old, useless habit, the way you check the time of anything that hurts you, as if the exact minute might mean something later. It did, as it turned out. Just not in any way I could have guessed, standing there in my kitchen with a phone going cold in my hand. I want to tell you a little about who my mother was to me before Renata's name became the last word she ever said to me on a phone. Eleanor raised 2 daughters more or less alone for the back half of my childhood, after my father, Walter, got sick the first time, the time he survived. She was not a soft woman. She did not say, "I love you," the way people do in movies, easily, over and over, like currency that never runs low. She said it in casseroles left on porches, and in the way she'd stay up correcting my algebra homework line by line at the kitchen table, with a mug of coffee going cold beside her elbow. I loved her the way you love a house you grew up in, completely, and without ever quite being able to explain why, to someone who hadn't lived there too. Renata is 2 years older than me. Growing up, she was the daughter who performed loudly and needed watching, and I was the daughter who managed quietly and needed nothing, which I have come to understand, much later in life, is its own kind of danger. The children who need nothing get given nothing, and then one day they're accused of having taken everything and given nothing back. If you've ever been the fine one in your family, the one nobody worried about because you never made noise, you already know exactly what I'm describing. Tell me in the comments if that was you too. I'd like to know I'm not the only one. The break happened the week my father died. I need to walk you through it carefully, because everything that came later, the hang-ups, the silence, the sister who told our whole extended family a story about me that wasn't true, grew out of 9 days in March 10 years ago, and I have turned those 9 days over in my mind so many times since that I could probably recite them to you in my sleep. My father's cancer came back this second time in February, and by early March, the doctors were using words like weeks instead of months. I flew in from 4 states away, and I did not leave his side for 9 days. Renata, who lived 20 minutes from our parents' house, came and went, an hour here, an hour there, always dressed like she had somewhere better to be, because she usually did. I'm not telling you this to make her sound cruel for the sake of it. I'm telling you because it matters later. And because for 10 years she managed to convince our mother and half our extended family that the opposite was true. On the 9th night, my husband, Michael, was in a car accident 40 minutes from the hospice where my father lay dying. A drunk driver ran a light. Michael was alive, but the highway patrolman who called me used words like critical and we need you here now. And I stood in that hospice hallway holding 2 phones, one with a nurse on it telling me my father likely had hours, the other with a trauma unit telling me my husband was being wheeled into surgery. And I had to choose. I chose Michael. I chose him because he was 38 years old and had a chance. And because my father, God rest him, squeezed my hand before I left the room and told me to go. That he understood. That he would wait for me if he could. He didn't wait. He died at 4 a.m., 11 hours before I could get back to that hospice room, sitting alone by then, because Renata had gone home to sleep. I have made peace, mostly, with the fact that I was not there when my father took his last breath. What I have never fully made peace with is what my sister did with that fact afterward. Because Renata did not tell our mother that I left because my husband was dying in a trauma unit. She told her I left because I couldn't be bothered to stay. She told her, and I only learned the exact wording of this years later from a cousin who finally couldn't carry it anymore, that I had, quote, picked Michael over Dad because Michael was more convenient to grieve for. She told our mother I hadn't even cried at the funeral, which was a lie, because I cried through the entire service with my husband's IV line still taped into the crook of my arm from the hospital bed they'd wheeled him out of that morning so he could say goodbye to his father-in-law. She said it enough times, in enough rooms, to enough people, that it hardened into fact. And my mother, drowning in her own grief and needing somewhere to put the unbearable unfairness of losing her husband, put it on me. She left us, became the sentence. I heard secondhand for years that this was what my mother said about me at church, at bridge club, to anyone who asked why her younger daughter never came around anymore. She left us. She doesn't get to come back when it's convenient. I want you to remember that sentence. It is going to come back later. And when it does, I need you to feel exactly the way I felt the first time I heard it repeated to my face. For the first 2 years after the funeral, I tried. God, I tried. I called every Sunday, even when the calls went unanswered. I sent cards for every birthday, every Mother's Day, every Christmas. Actual cards in the actual mail, because I knew my mother distrusted anything that came through a screen. I drove 4 hours each way, twice, to stand on her porch and be told, both times, through a closed door, that she wasn't ready to see me. By year 3, the calls started going to voicemail every single time. By year 5, I stopped expecting them to be picked up at all, and I kept calling anyway, the way you keep watering a plant you're fairly sure is already dead, because stopping feels like agreeing that it's dead. Somewhere in there, my mother moved out of the house I grew up in and into a place called Brookhaven, a senior residence 40 minutes outside the city, and Renata handled the whole transition. Renata got power of attorney. Renata became, for all practical purposes, the only version of my mother's world that my mother had left. Because Renata also, and I did not understand the size of this until much, much later, became the one who decided which calls got through to Eleanor's room phone and which ones didn't. I only had one person still in my corner through all of it, and she was 7 years old the year my father died, and she grew up watching what happened next. My niece, Sophie, Renata's own daughter, never fully bought the story her mother was selling. Kids notice things adults think they're too young to notice. Sophie noticed that her mother came home from Brookhaven some days lighter, almost pleased, after visits where she'd apparently checked on Grandma Eleanor and found her, quote, still refusing to talk about Aunt Claire. Sophie noticed that cards I sent never seemed to make it onto her grandmother's little corkboard of family photos, the way her own mother's did. Sophie started texting me in secret when she turned 15. Not often, maybe once a season, a photo of Eleanor at a Brookhaven event, a small update, always followed by, "Please don't tell my mom I sent this." Those texts were the only thread I had left to my mother's actual life for years. And I want you to hold on to Sophie, because she matters more to this story than almost anyone. By the time I got to that last Christmas Eve call, I had built a life that did not depend on my mother forgiving me, because I had learned the hard way that hoping for it was its own kind of hurt I could no longer afford. I had my husband, recovered now, walking with a cane, but alive and stubborn and mine. I had a good job managing patient intake at a hospice care network, an irony I have thought about more than once, spending my working life sitting with families at the very edge my own family fell apart on. I had made something like peace. And then the phone rang at 6:04. And for one foolish, hopeful minute, I thought maybe peace was about to become something better. It wasn't. It was just the last hang-up. I didn't know yet that it was also the beginning of the end of the lie that had run my family for a decade. At 9:11, my phone rang again, an unfamiliar 947 area code, and something in me, some old animal instinct built by years of bad calls, answered it fast before the second ring finished. "Is this Claire Ashford?" a woman's voice asked, calm, professional, the kind of voice trained to deliver news gently regardless of what the news was. "Yes," I said. "My name is Nurse Patel. I'm calling from County General. Your mother, Eleanor, was brought into our emergency department about an hour ago." There was a pause, and in that pause my whole body went cold, the phone suddenly heavy in my hand. "She's stable, but she's had a cardiac event, and she's listed you as her next of kin on her admission paperwork. Is there any way you can come in?" I remember gripping the kitchen counter with my free hand. I remember Michael appearing in the doorway, alarmed, mouthing, "What happened?" And I remember not being able to answer him yet, because I was still holding the phone against my ear, waiting for Nurse Patel to say she'd made a mistake, that she meant to call Renata, that there had been some clerical error, because that would have made more sense to me than the truth. "I'm sorry," I said. Did you say I'm listed as her next of kin? Yes, ma'am. Updated a few months back, according to the file. You're her primary contact. A few months back. Not a mistake made in the confusion of an emergency room at 9 o'clock on Christmas Eve. Months. My mother had, at some point in the recent past, sat down, or been sat down, and deliberately, on purpose, with her own hand or her own voice, put my name where my sister's had presumably been for a decade. I told the nurse I was on my way. I hung up and I looked at Michael, and I said the only sentence I had in me. My mother put me down as her next of kin months ago, and she hasn't spoken a real word to me in 10 years. He didn't say anything for a second. Then he grabbed the car keys off the hook by the door, because he already understood, before I did, that whatever we were about to walk into, it was going to change everything we thought we knew about the last 10 years. 40 minutes later, I was standing under the fluorescent lights of a county hospital lobby on Christmas Eve, my coat still buttoned wrong, my heart going so hard I could feel it in my ears, and a doctor in green scrubs was walking toward me with an expression I recognized instantly from my own line of work. The careful, braced expression of someone about to tell a family member something they need to hear before they see it. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "before I take you back, there's something you should know." I need you to sit with that sentence for a moment, the way I had to. Because on the other side of that curtain was not just my dying, no, not dying, stable, the nurse had said stable, I made myself hold on to that word, my hospitalized mother. On the other side of that curtain was my sister, and my sister had already been talking. 10 years is a long time to build a lie. It is also, as it turns out, exactly long enough for the truth to finish quietly assembling itself underneath it, waiting. I didn't know that yet, standing in that lobby. I only knew that my chest hurt and my hands were shaking, and somewhere past that curtain was the mother who hung up on me 3 hours earlier and had, apparently, been carrying my name in her pocket the whole time. Dr. Whitman had kind eyes and the tired posture of a man 6 hours into a Christmas Eve shift nobody wanted. He didn't rush me. He stood there in the hallway with his hand not quite touching my elbow. The professional, almost touch doctors learn to use on people who look like they might fall down. "Your mother came in with chest pain around 8:15, he said. "We stabilized her. It was a cardiac event, not a full heart attack, thank God, but her heart is under real strain, and we're keeping her overnight for observation, possibly longer." "Is she conscious?" I asked. "In and out. She's sedated, comfortable." He hesitated, and that hesitation is the part I remember most clearly, because good doctors don't hesitate over vitals. They hesitate over people. "Your sister arrived about 40 minutes before you did," he said carefully. "She's been in the room the whole time. I want you to know that before you go in, because she's said some things to our staff about your relationship with your mother, and I didn't want you walking in unprepared." "What kind of things?" I said, and I heard my own voice go very flat, very quiet, the way it does when I already suspect the answer and I'm bracing myself to hear it out loud anyway. "She told the intake coordinator that you and your mother have been estranged for years, and that she wasn't sure why your name was on the paperwork," Dr. Whitman said. "She asked us to change the emergency contact to herself before your mother woke up. Our policy is we don't alter a patient's stated wishes without the patient's consent, especially when the patient is oriented enough to have made that choice herself. So the form stands. You're still listed. But I wanted you to know what you're walking into, because I could tell there was tension, and I'd rather you hear it from me in a hallway than get blindsided in that room." I stood there for a second, letting that land. My sister had been in that room for less than an hour, our mother barely stabilized, machines still beeping, and her first instinct, her very first move, had been to try to get my name removed from the paperwork before I could even arrive. Not to call me herself, not to sit with our mother, to erase me from the record before I could become real again. "Thank you for telling me," I said, because it was true, and because I needed a second to compose my face before that curtain pulled back. "Is there anything else?" "One more thing." He glanced down at a folder in his hand, the kind of glance a man gives when he's deciding whether something is his business to say. "The paperwork where your mother listed you, it wasn't filled out tonight in the confusion. It's dated, back in September." He looked up at me. "I don't know the history here, Mrs. Ashford, and it's not my place to guess at it. But your mother made that choice on a regular Tuesday, months before any of this happened. I thought you should know that too." I stood there another moment, turning that sentence over the way you turn over a stone to see what's living underneath it. "Can I see it?" I asked. "The form, whatever she signed." Dr. Whitman hesitated again, and this time I understood the hesitation for what it was. Not reluctance to help me, but the particular caution of a man who has learned, over years of double shifts and family emergencies, that paperwork can detonate a room just as fast as bad news can. "I can have someone in medical records pull a copy for you," he said. "It's part of her chart. Your name is the one written on it, and I don't expect anyone here to argue about that." He glanced down the hall toward the nurse's station, where a woman in scrubs was typing something into a terminal, the blue light of the screen the only real brightness in that whole stretch of corridor. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Ashford. I don't usually notice these things. Intake forms come through by the dozen on a night like tonight. But this one, I noticed, because the date didn't match the emergency. Most people update this kind of form in the moment, in an ambulance, in triage, scared, filling in whatever name comes to mind first. Yours was already there, sitting in the system, waiting." Waiting. That word again. The same one Diane would use to me 2 days later about doors people leave for themselves. Except I didn't know Diane yet, didn't know Priya, didn't know any of what was coming. I only knew that I was standing in a hallway that smelled like hand sanitizer and reheated coffee, being told that my mother had quietly, deliberately, on some ordinary Tuesday months earlier, chosen me. And I had spent that same span of months believing, the way I'd trained myself to believe for a decade, that there was nothing left of me in her at all. I looked past Dr. Whitman's shoulder, back down the corridor toward the waiting area, where I could just make out Michael sitting stiff and upright in one of those molded plastic chairs, his cane hooked over the armrest, his coat still zipped to the throat because he hadn't been sure, driving over, whether we'd be allowed back at all on a night like this. He caught my eye and lifted 2 fingers off his knee. Not quite a wave, just a small signal that he was there, that he wasn't going anywhere, that whatever I found on the other side of that curtain, I wasn't going to have to carry it alone, the way I had carried so much else alone for the last 10 years. I held on to that small lift of his fingers longer than I probably needed to. It steadied something in me that had started shaking the second the word September left the doctor's mouth. 8 days after Labor Day, Dr. Whitman said, glancing at the folder again, and I don't know why that particular detail is the one that undid me a little, standing there in that hallway, but it did. 8 days after Labor Day. I remembered exactly where I had been 8 days after Labor Day, because I remember most Septembers now with a kind of grim, superstitious precision, the way people who've lost things start marking ordinary calendar days as though they might matter later. I had been sitting in my own kitchen that particular evening, phone in hand, scrolling to my mother's contact for what felt like the 400th time in a decade, my thumb hovering over the call button the way it always hovered. And then, the way it always did, retreating. I hadn't called. I remember telling myself it wouldn't matter if I did, that the line would ring twice, maybe 3 times, and go to a voicemail box that had been full for years, the way it always had. Or worse, that it would connect and I would hear, once again, my sister's voice picking up on my mother's behalf, cheerful and brittle, explaining that Mom was resting, that Mom wasn't up for calls tonight, that Mom would call me back when she felt ready. A callback that, in 10 years, had never once come. So I hadn't called that September evening. I had put the phone face down on the counter and made myself a cup of tea I didn't finish and gone to bed early, the way I'd learned to do on nights when the missing got too loud to sit with. And somewhere, 40 minutes away, on that same ordinary Tuesday, or close enough to it that the 2 nights have folded together in my memory ever since, my mother had apparently been sitting across a desk from some Brookhaven administrator, or a hospital intake nurse, or whoever it is that hands a frightened, aging woman a clipboard and a pen, and she had written my name in the blank space marked "Emergency Contact" in her own careful, upright handwriting that I hadn't seen in years but would have recognized anywhere, on any form, in any hallway, for the rest of my life. I didn't know that detail yet, standing there with Dr. Whitman. I wouldn't see the actual signature until later that week, when a records clerk finally printed the form out for me, and I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage and cried over 4 lines of my mother's handwriting, the way some people cry over eulogies. But I felt something of it already, some early tremor of it, standing in that corridor. Because here is the strange arithmetic of estrangement that nobody tells you about going in. You spend years building a version of the story that lets you survive the silence. You tell yourself she doesn't think of you. You tell yourself the door closed cleanly a long time ago, and there's a mercy in that, in not having to wonder anymore. And then one hallway, one folder, one date 8 days after Labor Day comes along and knocks the whole careful structure down in about 4 seconds, and you're left standing in the wreckage of a story you'd spent a decade convincing yourself was true. "There's one more thing I probably shouldn't tell you, but I'm going to anyway," Dr. Whitman said, lowering his voice slightly, glancing once toward the nurse's station as though checking that no one else was close enough to overhear. "Our admitting nurse tonight is the same one who was on shift back in September, when your mother's contact information was updated during a separate, unrelated visit. A minor fall, nothing serious. She was in and out same day. Small hospital system, small staff. We rotate through the same faces more than people realize." He paused, weighing something. "She remembered your mother asking, very specifically, that the form not go through the usual channel, not through the assisted living facilities paperwork, which apparently gets forwarded to a family contact for review. She asked for it to be handled directly, hospital to hospital, so to speak, kept out of the file that gets shared with Brookhaven's front office." I felt my whole body go still. She asked for it to be hidden. "I wouldn't use that word in a chart note," Dr. Whitman said carefully, the caution of a man who has learned not to hand grieving relatives words sharper than the ones he's certain of. "But she asked for it to be kept separate, private. That was the word our nurse remembered her using. Private." He closed the folder gently. "I don't know your family's history, Mrs. Ashford, and like I said, it's not my business to guess at it. But a woman doesn't ask for a piece of paperwork to be kept private from her own household unless she has a reason to believe someone in that household would interfere with it." I stood there, in that fluorescent-lit hallway, and let that sentence settle into me the way cold settles into a house with a door left open somewhere you can't find. Someone would interfere with it. My mother, 71 years old, sedated now on a gurney behind a curtain 40 feet from where I stood, had understood, back in September, months before any of this, that if she wrote my name down through the ordinary channels, Someone in her own household might make sure that name never reached the people who needed to see it. She had gone around it, quietly, deliberately, the way you route water around a blockage you've stopped expecting anyone to clear for you. I thought, standing there, of every unanswered call, every unopened envelope I'd imagined disintegrating somewhere in a landfill instead of ever reaching her hands. Every year I had told myself, gently, sadly, that this was simply what happens sometimes in families, that people drift, that grief reshapes love into distance, and there's no one to blame for it, that this was just the shape my mother's love had taken after my father died, and I would have to learn to live inside that shape whether I understood it or not. I had built an entire decade of grief around the idea that no one was keeping us apart, that it was simply happening, the way weather happens, the way rivers change course. Standing in that hallway, hearing a tired doctor use the word private like it was a small, careful gift he was handing me, I understood for the first time that it had never been weather at all. Someone had built a dam. "Thank you," I said again, because it was the only thing my mouth seemed capable of producing, and because some part of me needed a moment of ordinary courtesy to hold on to before whatever came next. Dr. Whitman nodded, the particular nod of a man who has said more than protocol probably allowed, and was choosing, generously, not to regret it. He glanced once more toward the curtained bay at the end of the hall, toward the low murmur of a heart monitor keeping its patient rhythm behind it, and then back at me. "She's going to be all right tonight," he said, gentler now, shifting back into the register doctors use when the hard part of the conversation is over and the human part is what's left. "I want you to hold on to that, whatever else you find out in there." Her heart gave her a scare, but it's steady now, and she's strong for her age. Whatever's waiting behind that curtain, the paperwork, your sister, all of it. None of that changes the fact that your mother is stable, and she asked for you months before she ever needed to. Months before she ever needed to. I turned that phrase over one more time, standing in that hallway with my coat still buttoned wrong and my hands finally starting to steady. And I thought about every version of this night I had imagined on the drive over. The version where I arrived to find a mother too far gone to know I'd come. The version where Renata had already turned the staff against me completely. The version where this was all some clerical mistake that would unravel the second anyone looked closely enough at it. None of those versions had prepared me for this one. A mother who had, on some forgettable Tuesday 8 days after Labor Day, quietly chosen me and gone out of her way to make sure no one else could unchoose me on her behalf. September. 3 months before this Christmas Eve, on some ordinary afternoon I knew nothing about, my mother had gone somewhere. An emergency room after a fall nobody ever told me about, a clipboard, a pen, and written my name down as the person she trusted to be called if her heart gave out. And 3 hours before that same heart actually did give out, she'd hung up on me because Renata walked into the room. I didn't understand it yet. I only knew, standing in that hallway with my coat still buttoned wrong, that 10 years of a story I had accepted as true. She doesn't want me. She chose Renata. I lost her for good. Had just developed a crack straight down the middle of it. And on the other side of a thin hospital curtain, my sister was standing guard over that crack, and she had no idea I had already seen it. "I'm ready," I told the doctor, and he nodded, and he walked me down the hall, and he pulled back the curtain, and there she was, Renata, arms crossed, coat still on, standing between me and our mother's bed like she'd been posted there on purpose. Her face, when she saw me, did something I had not seen it do in 10 years. It went pale, and then it went furious, in that order in under 2 seconds. "What are you doing here?" Renata said. Not a question, a door slamming. I looked past her, at our mother, small and pale against white sheets, an oxygen line under her nose, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in the shallow, careful rhythm of someone whose heart had just reminded her it was mortal. 10 years since I'd been within 10 feet of her. 10 years since I'd smelled her particular lavender hand cream, seen the specific silver of her hair, watched her breathe. "She's my mother," I said quietly, and I stepped past my sister into the room, and I sat down in the chair on the side of the bed that Renata clearly hadn't expected anyone to claim, and I took my mother's cool, thin hand in mine, and I did not let go, no matter what Renata said next. Because I had a feeling, a strong, quiet, certain feeling, the kind I hadn't let myself have in a decade, that whatever had put my name on that form back in September was still sitting somewhere inside my mother, waiting for someone to come find it. And I intended to find it. Renata did not sit down. She stood at the foot of the bed with her arms crossed, watching me hold our mother's hand like I was committing a crime in front of witnesses. "You need to leave," she said, low, so the sleeping woman between us wouldn't wake. "You lost the right to be in this room a long time ago." "The hospital called me," I said, keeping my voice level, keeping my eyes on our mother's face instead of my sister's. "Not you, me. She listed me." She was confused. She's 71 years old and she'd just moved into a new wing at Brookhaven. They probably handed her the wrong form. She probably didn't even read what she was signing. "Renata." I finally looked at her. "It's dated September. That's not confusion. That's 3 months of her knowing exactly what she wrote." My sister's mouth opened and then closed, and for just a second, 1 second, gone as fast as it came, I saw something flicker across her face that looked almost like fear. Then it hardened back into the expression I remembered from every family gathering of my adult life. The one that said she had already decided how this story was going to be told, and my version of events was not invited to the telling. "You show up once, after 10 years, because a nurse happened to call you," she said, "and suddenly you're the daughter of the year? She doesn't even talk to you. When was the last time you actually spoke to her, Claire? Really spoke to her, not just left some voicemail to make yourself feel better?" I didn't answer right away, because the honest answer, years, it had been years, was exactly the ammunition she wanted. And I had learned, somewhere in that decade of silence, not to hand my sister ammunition anymore. Instead, I looked down at our mother's hand in mine, at the thin gold wedding band she'd never taken off even 10 years after our father died, and I said, very quietly, "I don't know why she put my name on that form, but I know it wasn't nothing, and I think you know that too, or you wouldn't have tried to get it changed before I even walked in the door." Renata went very still. "Who told you that?" "Does it matter?" "It matters because it's not true. I asked a question about the paperwork, that's all, because it seemed like a mistake." "Dr. Whitman doesn't think it was a mistake," I said. "He thinks she meant it." My mother's fingers moved in mine, just slightly, a small pressure, not quite a squeeze, more like the ghost of one, and both Renata and I went silent at the same moment, watching her face for any sign she was surfacing. She didn't wake, but her hand had moved, and some old, wounded, hopeful part of me chose to believe she'd heard every word. I sat there a long moment, just holding on to that small pressure, that tiny proof of life passing between us. And I realized my sister was still standing at the foot of the bed, watching me the way you watch something dangerous that's gotten loose in a room you thought was secure. A nurse, not Patel, a different one, younger, with a tablet in her hand, came in to check the monitors, and as she leaned over to adjust a line, she said, almost offhandedly, to no one in particular, She had us a little worried a few hours ago, but she's a fighter. Kept trying to say something before we sedated her for the night. She glanced at the chart. Kept saying a name. We couldn't quite make it out, something like Claire? We figured it might have been for the daughter listed on the intake form. Renata's face did something complicated and fast, and she turned it toward the window before either the nurse or I could read it fully. But I saw enough. I saw the exact moment my sister understood that whatever version of our mother she had spent 10 years curating for the rest of the family, the version who despised me, who never spoke my name, who had cut me off completely and for good, that version had just been quietly, unknowingly contradicted by our mother's own unconscious mouth in front of hospital staff. I have spent years since that night trying to describe exactly what passed across my sister's face in that half-second before she turned toward the window, and the closest I can come is this. It was the face of someone watching a wall they built with their own hands develop its first hairline crack. Small enough to still deny, but real enough that some animal part of them already understood, before their conscious mind caught up, that the wall was no longer load-bearing. I had seen that face on grieving families 100 times in my work. The moment someone realizes a diagnosis they'd been managing quietly for months has just become undeniable to everyone else in the room. I had simply never expected to see it on my own sister, over me. The young nurse with the tablet finished adjusting a line and glanced between the two of us, sensing, the way hospital staff learn to sense these things quickly, that she had walked into the middle of something that predated the machines beeping around her. "I'll let the doctor know she's resting easier," she said carefully, professionally, backing toward the curtain. Then, almost as an afterthought, pausing at the edge of the little cloth partition, she added, "Since you're listed as her contact, Mrs. Ashford, there's a healthcare questionnaire we usually go over with the primary contact once the patient's stabilized. Nothing urgent tonight, but someone from case management will probably reach out in the next day or two, just to confirm her wishes are on file correctly. Advance directive, medication list, that kind of thing." I said I understood, though in truth, the phrase landed somewhere deeper than understanding. Her wishes are on file correctly. I thought of the word private again, the word Dr. Whitman's nurse had used back in September, and I understood, standing there, that whatever my mother had built into that quiet paperwork months ago wasn't only about who got a phone call in an emergency. It was about who got asked, going forward, what she actually wanted. Not what Renata decided on her behalf, what she wanted. Renata's spine had gone very straight at the mention of the advance directive, and I watched her reach into her coat pocket for her phone, glancing at the screen the way people do when they need an excuse to look at something other than the room they're standing in. "I need to step out and make a call," she said, to no one in particular, already moving toward the curtain. "Sophie's probably wondering where I am." I let her go without comment, though something in the too quick way she'd said Sophie's name, the way she'd reached for it like a life raft, told me the call she was about to make had very little to do with our niece. I watched the curtain fall closed behind her, watched her silhouette pause just beyond it in the hallway, phone already lifted to her ear before she'd taken 3 steps, her voice dropping into that low, urgent register people use when they don't want to be overheard saying something they already suspect is indefensible. I couldn't make out the words. I didn't try very hard to. I had learned over 10 years that trying to catch every fragment of what Renata said behind my back had never once made me feel better, only more tired. And that night, I didn't have the energy to spend on anything that wasn't sitting in that chair holding my mother's hand. So instead, I sat there in the relative quiet, the monitor's soft rhythm the only sound besides the muffled hospital noise beyond the curtain, and I let myself, for the first time in years, actually look at my mother's face without an audience. She looked smaller than I remembered her. Not just older, I had braced myself for older, had done the math 100 times over the years, 71 now, 72 next spring. But smaller in a way that had nothing to do with age, the particular smallness of someone who has spent a long time being managed instead of asked. Her hair, still that same silvery white I remembered, was combed back neatly from her forehead, the way it always was, and for a moment, sitting there in the low light, I let myself drift backward, the way grief sometimes lets you drift when you're finally still enough to let it. I thought of a kitchen in late autumn, decades ago, flour dusted across a wooden table, my mother's hands, younger then, quicker, unlined, folding dough for the same apple hand pies she made every year the week before Thanksgiving. I couldn't have been more than 8. Renata would have been 10, already restless, already drifting toward the living room television the moment the interesting part of any task was finished. And I remember my mother not minding, not once, letting Renata go and keeping me at the table instead, showing me how to crimp the edges of the dough with the tines of a fork, patient in a way she rarely had the luxury of being patient, given everything else she was carrying that year with my father between jobs, and money tight enough that those apple pies were, I understood only much later, one of the only extravagances she allowed the household that whole autumn. "You have good hands for this," she'd told me, that particular afternoon, flour on her knuckles, a smudge of it on her cheekbone she wouldn't notice until she caught her reflection in the oven door glass hours later. Patient hands. Renata rushes everything. You don't. I remember feeling, at 8 years old, like I had been handed something precious and secret, some small proof that my mother saw me clearly, saw something in me worth naming, even if she rarely said it out loud again in quite those words. I had forgotten that memory for years, genuinely forgotten it, the way grief sometimes buries the gentlest memories deepest, because they hurt more to carry than the difficult ones. Sitting in that hospital chair with her hand in mine, it came back, whole, unbidden, the smell of cinnamon and browning butter as vivid as if I were standing in that kitchen, instead of this fluorescent antiseptic room. I don't know how long I sat there with that memory, turning it over the way you turn over something small and warm on a cold night. Long enough that the machines had cycled through several quiet rhythms, long enough that my own breathing had slowed to something closer to hers. I thought about all the years since that autumn kitchen, the years I'd told myself, in my worst moments, that maybe my mother had simply never loved me the way she loved Renata, that maybe the silence of the last decade wasn't a wall built by someone else at all, but the truest version of how she'd always felt underneath the surface, finally given permission to surface once my father wasn't there to keep the peace between us. I had believed that theory on my hardest nights more than I ever admitted to Michael, more than I admitted to almost anyone. And sitting there now, with a form dated 8 days after Labor Day sitting somewhere in a hospital file with my name on it in her own handwriting, I understood how much of that decade of grief I had spent grieving something that had never actually been true. Renata came back through the curtain 11 minutes later. I know it was 11 minutes because I'd found myself, without quite meaning to, watching the clock on the wall above the monitor, marking time the way you do when you're waiting to see what shape the next thing coming toward you is going to take. Her face had rearranged itself again by the time she stepped back into the room, smoothed over into something closer to composure, though her jaw was tighter than it had been before she left, and she didn't quite meet my eyes as she crossed back to the foot of the bed. "Sophie's fine," she said, unprompted, though I hadn't asked. "She's at a friend's for the night. I told her I'd be here a while." She glanced at our mother, at the slow rise and fall of her chest, and something crossed her face that I couldn't fully read. Not quite tenderness, not quite guilt. Something caught uncomfortably between the two. "The nurse mentioned the advance directive," she said, and her voice had a careful, testing quality to it now, like she was choosing each word from a much larger pile of things she wanted to say and discarding the sharper ones. I've had power of attorney for 7 years, Claire. Whatever paperwork got updated in September doesn't change any of that. I want to make sure you understand that before you get any ideas about what tonight means. I looked up at her, at the particular brittleness in her posture, the way she stood with her arms crossed like she was bracing against wind that wasn't there. "I'm not here to take anything from you, Renata," I said, and I meant it, in that moment, as simply and honestly as I had ever meant anything. "I'm here because a nurse called me and told me our mother listed me as the person to call if she died. I didn't come here to fight you for power of attorney. I came here because I love her, and because some part of her, apparently, still wanted me in the room if something like tonight ever happened." Renata didn't answer right away. For a moment, just a moment, something in her face looked almost young, almost like the sister I remembered from before any of this, before our father died, and the whole shape of our family reorganized itself around his absence and her control. Then it closed again, the way a door closes when someone remembers, mid-motion, exactly why they were closing it in the first place. "That doesn't mean anything," Renata said, too quickly to the window. "She's on medication. People say all kinds of things." I didn't argue with her. I had learned over 10 years that arguing with Renata in the moment never worked, because she would simply restate her version louder and with more conviction until the conversation exhausted itself in her favor. So instead, I just sat there, holding my mother's hand, and I let the silence stretch. And somewhere in that silence, I made a decision that would take weeks to fully carry out, though I didn't know the shape of it yet. I decided I was not leaving this hospital, this family, this decade of silence, without understanding exactly why my mother had written my name on a form in September and then hung up on me on Christmas Eve. Something did not fit. And I have spent my career learning that when something doesn't fit, you don't walk away from it. You pull the thread until the whole shape of it comes loose. Renata left around midnight, claiming she needed to get home to Sophie. Though something in the rigid set of her shoulders as she gathered her coat told me she was leaving because she could no longer stand to watch me sit in that chair. At the doorway, she turned back, and for one moment, I thought she might say something almost human, an acknowledgement, even a small one, of the strangeness of the night we'd just had. Instead, she said, "Don't get used to this, Claire, whatever this is. Mom's not going to remember any of it once she's better. She never does." And then she was gone, her heels sharp against the linoleum, and I was alone with my mother and the quiet beeping of machines counting out her heartbeat in careful, patient numbers. I stayed until 3 in the morning, until a kind nurse gently suggested I go home and rest, that Eleanor was stable and sedated and wouldn't wake before daylight. I kissed my mother's forehead, the first time I'd kissed her in 10 years. And I drove home through empty Christmas streets with my hands too tight on the wheel. And I did not cry until I got to the driveway. And then I cried for a long time, the ugly kind, the kind you can only do alone in a parked car at 4 in the morning on Christmas Day. Grieving a decade you thought was already finished grieving. But underneath the grief, something else was starting to take shape. A question. Why September?
Why my name?
quietly, months before any of this, with no phone call, no letter, no explanation, buried in a form nobody was supposed to see unless something went wrong. My mother had done something on purpose, and somewhere between that hospital room and my own front door, I understood that I was not going to rest until I knew what it was, and why she'd never told me, and the question that frightened me most of all, whether Renata had known and had been hiding it from both of us the whole time. I went back to that hospital every day for the next 4 days. Eleanor drifted in and out, mostly sleeping, occasionally lucid for a stretch of 10 or 20 minutes, where she'd blink at the ceiling and ask a nurse what day it was. And each time I sat in that chair holding her hand, terrified and hopeful in equal measure that this would be the time she turned her head and looked at me and said something more than my sedated, half-conscious name. It didn't happen right away. Grief, I have learned, does not care about your timeline. It moves at its own pace, and mine was about to move faster than I expected because of a woman named Diane Okafor. Diane and I had been friends for years, and she happened to be an elder law attorney, the kind who spent her days untangling exactly the sort of quiet family knots I was starting to suspect I'd walked into. I called her on the second day, still shaking, and I told her everything. The September date, Renata's attempt to change the contact form, the years of intercepted calls I was only now beginning to suspect had actually been intercepted rather than simply refused. Diane went very quiet on the other end of the line, the particular quiet of a professional recognizing a pattern. "Claire," she said finally, "I want you to listen to me carefully, and I want you to not panic while I explain why. Your sister has power of attorney over your mother, correct? Since the move to Brookhaven, 7 years ago. And in 7 years, have you ever once seen a bank statement, a financial record, anything showing you exactly how that authority has been used?" "No," I admitted. "I haven't seen anything. She never shared any of it with me. I assumed, I don't know what I assumed, that it wasn't my business anymore since I wasn't in the picture." "That's exactly the assumption people count on," Diane said, gently but firmly, the voice of a woman who had said this sentence to 100 frightened family members before me. "I'm not saying anything has happened. I'm saying that a POA with zero oversight, combined with a decade of controlled communication, combined with a mother who apparently updated her emergency contact without telling the person holding that authority, that's a pattern I've seen before, and it's worth looking into carefully, quietly, before you say a single word to your sister about any of it." I remember sitting very still on my kitchen stool, phone pressed to my ear, feeling something cold and clear settle over the grief I'd been carrying for 2 days. It wasn't anger yet. It was something more useful than anger. It was clarity, the kind that comes right before you stop asking why something happened to you and start figuring out exactly what you're going to do about it. "Where do I even start?" I asked. "You start quietly," Diane said. "You don't confront her. You don't accuse her of anything, not yet. Not until you actually have something. You start by finding out what's true. Does your mother have a will? Do you know if it's been changed recently? Has anyone besides Renata seen your mother's financial accounts in the last several years? And Claire," she paused, and I could hear her weighing how much to say. "I'd also start asking whether your mother's decision to name you as next of kin in September was really the beginning of anything, or whether it might have been the end of something else." People who feel trapped sometimes leave themselves one small door out, quietly, in case they ever get the chance to walk through it. That sentence stayed with me the rest of the night. A small door out. I thought about my mother, 71 years old, sitting in a hospital exam room on a Tuesday afternoon in September, filling out a form nobody was supposed to notice, leaving herself one small door in case she ever needed it. I thought about the possibility that she hadn't cut me off at all, that she'd been cut off from me, slowly, deliberately, by someone standing between us the whole time, someone who had every reason to make sure that door never got found. The next piece of the puzzle came from the person I least expected and most trusted, Sophie. She showed up at my house 2 days after Christmas, 17 years old now, in her mother's old car, looking like she'd been building up the courage to knock on my door for longer than the drive over had taken. I opened the door and she just stood there for a second, and then she said, "Aunt Claire, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not tell my mom I told you." I brought her inside, made her tea she didn't drink, and sat with her at my kitchen table while she pulled her phone out of her coat pocket with hands that weren't quite steady. "I've been visiting Grandma Eleanor on my own since I got my license," she said. "Not with Mom, just me after school sometimes. She likes when I read to her." Sophie's voice cracked a little. "She talks about you, Aunt Claire. Not like Mom says she talks about you. She doesn't say you left us or any of that. She asks me if I've heard from you. She asks if you're happy. Last spring, she started asking me to help her write letters, actual letters, on paper, and she'd have me mail them because she said the phone wasn't safe, that things got lost when she tried to call." I sat there gripping my mug so hard my knuckles went white. "Sophie, did any of those letters ever reach me?" She shook her head and her eyes filled up. "I don't know what happened to them after I mailed them. I always used the mailbox at the corner, not the one at Brookhaven, because Grandma made me promise. She said—" Sophie stopped, swallowed hard, and made herself finish. "She said the front desk passed things along to Mom sometimes, whether she wanted them to or not. I didn't understand what she meant back then. I think I do now." I never received a single one of those letters. Not one, in 9 months of my mother apparently writing to me, trusting a 17-year-old with paper and stamps because she no longer trusted the phone, the front desk, or, I was beginning to understand, her own eldest daughter. Somewhere between a corner mailbox and my front door, 9 months of my mother reaching for me had simply vanished. "There's one more thing," Sophie said, and she scrolled through her phone with trembling fingers before turning the screen toward me. It was a photo she'd taken months earlier, almost by accident, she said, of a drawer in her mother's home office standing open while Renata was on a work call in another room. Inside the drawer, visible in the photo, was a stack of envelopes, at least a dozen, some clearly old, addressed in handwriting I recognized instantly, because it was mine. Christmas cards, birthday cards, every single one I had mailed for years, collected, unopened, hidden in a drawer in my sister's house instead of ever making it to Brookhaven. I put the phone down on the table because my hands were shaking too badly to keep holding it steady. 10 years. 10 years of believing my mother had simply stopped wanting to hear from me, and there, in a photograph taken by a scared 17-year-old, was proof that every single attempt I'd made had been quietly, systematically confiscated before it could ever reach her. "Why would she do that?" I whispered, though some cold, clear part of me already knew the answer. The same part of me that had spent a career reading intake files and understanding exactly what people do when they're afraid of losing control over something valuable. Sophie looked down at her hands. "I think," she said slowly, carefully, like she'd rehearsed this sentence 100 times before finding the courage to say it out loud. "I think Mom's been managing all of Grandma's money since the move, and I think Grandma started asking questions about it last spring, right around when she started asking me to write to you. I heard them fighting once, before I was supposed to be home. Grandma said something about wanting to see her real bank statements, not just the summary Mom brings her to sign. Mom got really upset. She said something like, "You don't need to worry about that. That's what I'm here for." And Grandma said, Sophie's voice dropped almost to nothing. She said, "I want to talk to Claire." I sat in my kitchen that evening with my 17-year-old niece, both of us quietly crying over cold tea, and I understood, finally, completely, that the story I had believed for 10 years, that my mother chose Renata and let me go, was not the true story. The true story was that my mother had never let me go at all. Someone had been standing in the doorway the entire time, making sure I never got close enough to find out. Sophie sat there across from me in the dim kitchen light, her tea long gone cold, and for a while neither of us said anything at all. Some silences fill a room the way sound would. This one did. I remember the refrigerator humming behind me, the tick of the wall clock, the particular late evening quiet of a house that has stopped expecting anyone else to come home that night. I reached across the table and took her hand, the same way I had taken my mother's hand in that hospital room 3 nights earlier, and I realized, holding it, that this 17-year-old girl had been carrying the true shape of my family's silence for months, alone, with no one to hand it to. "You didn't do anything wrong," I told her, because I could see, underneath the fear on her face, a second fear trying to surface. The fear that she had betrayed her mother by showing me that photograph, that whatever came next because of it would somehow be her fault. "Sophie, look at me. You didn't create any of this. You just refused to keep pretending it wasn't happening. Those are 2 very different things, and I need you to understand the difference, because I think you're about to spend a while blaming yourself for something that was never yours to carry." She wiped her face with the heel of her hand, the gesture so achingly like a much younger child's that it caught in my chest. "I've known for months," she said. Not everything. Not the money part, not really. I only started putting that together recently. But the cards. I found that drawer back in the fall, and I've thought about telling you every single day since, and every single day I talked myself out of it, because I kept thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if there's some explanation? What if I ruin everything for nothing? She looked up at me, and there was something raw and young in her face, something asking, without quite asking, whether she'd waited too long. "Grandma's heart attack happened 3 days ago. I keep thinking, if I'd shown you that photo back in October, would any of that still have happened to her?" I want to tell you that I answered that question easily, that I reassured her instantly and completely. But the honest truth is that I sat with it a moment first, because it deserved a real answer instead of a fast one. "I don't think you can carry that," I said finally. "None of us know what would have happened if things had gone differently. What I do know is that you're 17 years old, and you found the courage to bring me the truth before I even knew there was a decade of my mother reaching for me, buried underneath everything I'd been told. Most adults in this family never did that, Sophie. Not once, in 10 years. You did it at 17, scared, with everything to lose. That's not nothing. That's the opposite of nothing." She cried harder then, the kind of crying that comes when something someone's been bracing against finally gets set down. And I got up and came around the table and held her, the way I imagine I would have held my own daughter, if Michael and I had ever had one. The way I remembered being held myself, once, at that same kitchen table, decades earlier and 40 minutes away, by a mother folding pie dough with patient hands. When she finally quieted, I made us both a fresh pot of tea, because it felt like the kind of night that called for doing something ordinary with your hands while your mind tried to catch up with everything it had just been handed. "Tell me about the visits," I said, once we were both settled again, mugs steaming between us. "The ones you did on your own." I want to understand what her life has actually been like, Sophie, not the version I've been imagining for 10 years. Sophie wrapped both hands around her mug and thought for a moment before she answered, choosing her words carefully, the way people do when they sense a subject matters more than it might first appear. She's sharper than Mom lets on, she said slowly. Like, Mom always talks about her like she's fragile, confused, needs everything managed for her. But when it's just me and her, she's not like that at all. She remembers everything. She asks about my classes, my friends, whether I'm still doing debate club. She remembers your birthday, Aunt Claire, every year. She always asks me if I know what you did for it. Sophie's voice caught slightly. I never had anything to tell her. I didn't really know you. Not really. Not until the last couple years when I started texting you myself. I used to just say I didn't know, and she'd get this look on her face, like she was disappointed but trying not to show it, and she'd change the subject to something else. I thought of every birthday I'd spent for the last decade. Modest, private, occasionally marked with nothing more than Michael bringing home a small cake. Most years passing with a familiar, well-worn ache instead of celebration, because celebrating alone had started to feel like more trouble than it was worth. I had assumed, all those years, that my mother had simply stopped tracking the date, stopped caring whether I turned 38, then 40, then 45, alone in a house 40 minutes from hers. I had never once imagined her asking a teenage girl, every single year, whether anyone had told her what her estranged daughter had done to mark the day. There's something else, Sophie said, and her voice dropped slightly, careful again, testing the ground before she committed to it. Last time I visited, maybe 6 weeks before the hospital, she asked me to help her with something. She had this little metal box, like a lockbox, hidden in the back of her closet, behind some winter coats. She had me help her go through some old papers in it. Deeds, I think, some certificates. I didn't look too closely because it felt private. But there was a folder in there, a plain manila folder, and on the front, in her handwriting, it said, Claire. Just that. Your name. I set my mug down slowly, my hand not entirely steady. Did she say what was in it? No. She just wanted to make sure it was still there, still safe, I think. She checked it, nodded to herself, and put the lid back on the box, and put the box back behind the coats. She made me promise not to mention it to Mom. Sophie looked at me, something almost apologetic in her expression, like she was sorry not to have a more satisfying answer. I've thought about that folder 100 times since. I don't know what's in it. But she keeps it close, Aunt Claire. Whatever it is, she keeps it close and hidden, and she checks on it like it matters. I sat with that image for a long time after Sophie finally left that night, driving carefully back to her friend's house under a strict promise to text me the second she got there safely. A small habit I found myself falling into instantly and completely. The way you fall into caring for someone the moment you understand how alone they've been carrying something. A manila folder, hidden behind winter coats, with my name written on the front in my mother's careful, upright hand. Somewhere in that folder, I suspected, might be the fuller shape of everything the September form had only hinted at. Not just an emergency contact update, but something more deliberate, more complete. A document my mother had built quietly, over time, the way people build things when they know, on some level, that they might not be believed unless they can hold up proof. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in the dark beside Michael, who woke once, groggy, and asked if I was all right. And I told him some version of the truth, that I had learned things that evening that were going to change how I understood every year of the last decade. and that I didn't yet know what to do with all of it. Only that I could no longer sit still with it, either. He reached over in the dark and found my hand without needing to see it. The familiar, unhesitating gesture of a long marriage. And he said, "Whatever you need to do, Claire. I mean that. Whatever it takes." I held on to that sentence through most of that long, sleepless night. The way I'd held on to the small lift of his fingers in the hospital waiting room 3 nights earlier. Some kinds of support don't need to be loud to be load-bearing. By morning, I had made a decision, though it had taken most of the night to arrive at it cleanly. I was not going to confront Renata directly. Not yet. Not with only a photograph of a drawer and a niece's fragmented memories to stand on. I had learned enough, over a career spent sitting with grieving and frightened families, to know that confrontation without proof accomplishes almost nothing, except giving the person you're confronting time to clean up whatever they don't want found. What I needed instead was exactly what Diane had once, years earlier, at some long-forgotten dinner party, mentioned she specialized in. The quiet, careful, procedurally correct work of finding out what was actually true before anyone else in the family knew I was looking. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, much the way my mother once had, correcting my algebra homework. And I made a short list on the back of an old envelope, because some habits from my hospice intake years never leave you. You learn, in that work, that grief moves faster and clearer when you give it somewhere specific to land. The list was short. Find out what's actually in that folder. Find out where my mother's house sale money actually went. Find out how long the mail had truly been intercepted, and by whom, exactly, at Brookhaven's End. Because someone on staff had to have been complicit, even passively, for a system like that to run for over a year without anyone flagging it. And underneath all of that, in slightly smaller handwriting, a 4th line I almost didn't write down at all, because it felt too tender to put into words. Find out if she still loves me the way I've always hoped, underneath everything Renata built between us. I looked at that list for a long while before I picked up my phone.
10 years of silence had taught me patience, whether I'd wanted the lesson or not. But patience, I was beginning to understand that morning, is not the same thing as passivity. You can wait a long time for the right moment to act. What you cannot do, if you actually intend to survive what's been done to you, is mistake the waiting itself for the whole of your strength. The waiting was over. I had spent a decade absorbing what my family told me was true. I was done absorbing. I was ready, finally, to find out for myself. I called Diane that same morning, and this time my voice wasn't shaking with grief anymore. It was steady and cold and clear, the way it gets right before I start building something instead of just surviving something. "I need you to help me find out exactly what my sister has done with my mother's money," I said. "And I need to do it quietly, and I need to do it fast, because I think my mother has been trying to reach me for 9 months, and I think somebody has been making very sure that she couldn't." Diane didn't hesitate. "Then let's get to work," she said. "But Claire, do this right and do it carefully. If your sister has been managing your mother's finances improperly for years, we don't want to tip her off before we have the paper to prove it. People like this don't panic quietly. They panic in ways that destroy evidence." I understood exactly what she meant. And I understood, sitting there with Sophie's photograph open on my own phone in front of me, that the next weeks of my life were going to require every ounce of the same quiet, patient discipline I had used for a decade just to survive the silence. Except now, For the first time in 10 years, that discipline had a direction. It had a purpose. And it had my mother's real voice, however faint, somewhere underneath it, finally starting to come through. The weeks that followed moved slower than I wanted and faster than I was prepared for, both at once, the way real investigations tend to. Diane connected me with a colleague of hers who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet unwinding, a forensic elder care consultant named Priya Nair, a soft-spoken woman with an eye for numbers that didn't add up. I gave Priya everything I had. The September date on the hospital form, Sophie's photograph of the hidden cards, the fragments of overheard arguments about bank statements. It wasn't much on its own. But Priya explained that in cases like this, it rarely is much on its own. It's 100 small threads that, pulled together, become a rope. The first real thread came from Brookhaven itself. Because I was still listed as my mother's emergency contact, a status Renata had never successfully overturned, no matter how many calls she apparently made to the front office in the days after the hospital, I was allowed in to visit. And eventually, with my mother's slowly returning consent as she grew stronger and more lucid each week, to sit with her care coordinator and review the basic residency file. What I found there was small but strange. A note, dated 14 months earlier, logged by a Brookhaven staff member stating that resident expressed frustration regarding limited outside contact and requested assistance mailing personal correspondence independently. 14 months. Long before Sophie ever started helping with letters. My mother had been asking for help reaching me for over a year, quietly through official channels, and someone had been intercepting the results before they ever reached my mailbox. I sat with that note in my car in the Brookhaven parking lot for a long time before I could make myself drive home. It is a very particular kind of grief, discovering that the person you believed had rejected you had actually been fighting, in small and mostly powerless ways, to reach you the entire time. 2 weeks into January, my mother was strong enough for longer visits, off the sedation entirely, sharper each day. And one gray Tuesday afternoon, sitting in the small sunroom at Brookhaven with a blanket over her knees and her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, she finally said the thing I had been waiting a decade to hear. "I never stopped wanting to talk to you, Claire," she said, not looking at me, looking instead at the frost patterns on the window glass. "I want you to know that first, before anything else gets said in this family. I don't know exactly what happened to all the things I tried to send, but I know I tried." "I know, Mom," I said, and I reached over and took her hand, and for the first time in 10 years, she squeezed back, fully conscious, fully present, fully mine again in some small, hard-won way. "I know you tried." She told me, slowly, over that visit and several more that followed, pieces of what her life inside that decade had actually looked like, pieces she hadn't had the words or the courage to say out loud until she nearly died and realized how much time she might have already lost. She told me Renata had convinced her, in the raw, devastated weeks right after our father's funeral, that reaching out to me would only invite more pain, that I had made my choice, that the kindest thing for everyone was distance. She told me that over the years, whenever she'd tried to push back, a phone call attempted, a letter drafted, something always seemed to go wrong. Numbers that didn't connect, cards that Renata offered gently to mail for her since she was already going to the post office. A pattern so slow and so wrapped in apparent helpfulness that my mother had spent years unable to name what was actually happening to her, only feeling more and more that some door she wanted open kept quietly, mysteriously staying shut. "I started to wonder if I was losing my mind," she told me once, her voice small. "If maybe I really had pushed you away and just couldn't remember doing it right. That's a terrible thing, Claire, to not trust your own memory of your own child."
I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to, because that is the particular cruelty of what my sister had built. Not just isolation, but a fog around my mother's own certainty. A decade-long campaign so patient and so well disguised as care that even the victim herself began to doubt what was true. Meanwhile, Priya's quiet work into the financial side of things was turning up its own troubling pattern. Over 7 years of holding power of attorney, Renata had moved my mother from her own modest, paid-off house into Brookhaven, a reasonable, even loving decision on its face. But the sale of that house, worth just over $300,000, had generated funds that, according to the limited records Priya could access through the proper legal channels, had been distributed in ways that didn't fully track. A significant portion had gone toward Brookhaven's fees, yes, appropriately, but roughly $91,000 over 5 years had moved through transfers to accounts that, on paper, were listed under a business name, Ashford Family Holdings, LLC, that, as it turned out, had exactly one signer, Renata. It's not proof of anything criminal yet, Priya told me carefully, over coffee in her small downtown office, spreading printouts across the table between us. POA holders are allowed some discretion, and there are legitimate reasons funds move through intermediary accounts. But $91,000, Claire, over 5 years, with no itemized accounting your mother was ever shown. That's the kind of number adult protective services take seriously, especially paired with what you've described about the intercepted mail. I remember exactly how that felt, hearing it laid out in a stranger's calm, careful voice. Not vindication exactly, not yet, but the sensation of a shape I had suspected finally becoming visible in daylight. For 10 years, I had believed the story that I was the one who had failed my family. Now I was sitting in an office with numbers on a page suggesting that while I had been failing to reach my mother, someone else had been quietly succeeding at something much worse. And doing it in my name, using my absence as cover. Diane helped me file, quietly and properly, for what's called an accounting demand, a formal legal request requiring a power of attorney holder to produce a full record of how they've managed a principal's assets. It's not an accusation. It's a right my mother had, and one I could help her exercise now that she was lucid enough to consent to it, now that she was, finally, ready to want the truth as badly as I did. She's going to know something's happening, I said to Diane the night before we filed. The second that demand hits her lawyer's desk, Renata is going to know. Yes, Diane agreed. But Claire, that's the point. Right now, she believes she's still in complete control of the story. She believes your mother is confused, unreliable, easily managed, and that you are the outsider with no standing to challenge any of it. The accounting demand is the first thing that will make her understand that isn't true anymore. And people who've built 10 years of control on top of other people's silence tend to make their worst mistakes in the first few days after that silence breaks. I thought about the drawer full of unopened cards. I thought about the note from 14 months ago. My mother quietly asking Brookhaven staff for help reaching a daughter she'd been told, over and over, had abandoned her. I thought about the sentence Renata had handed down like scripture for a decade. She left us. She doesn't get to come back when it's convenient. And I understood, sitting in Diane's office with the accounting demand ready to be filed, that I was finally, after 10 long years, in a position to hand that sentence back to the person it actually belonged to. We filed on a Thursday in late January. By Saturday, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in over a decade. And for the first time in 10 years, my sister was calling me.
I let it ring twice before I answered, not for effect, but because my hands needed the extra seconds to stop shaking. "Hello, Renata." "What is this?" she said. No greeting. Her voice tight and fast in a way I had never once heard from her before, not even at our father's funeral. "I got a letter from a lawyer today, an accounting demand. What did you do?" "I didn't do anything except help Mom exercise a right she's always had," I said, keeping my voice level, the way Diane had coached me to, the way I'd learned to speak with grieving families 100 times at work, calm even when the room around me wasn't. "She's allowed to ask to see how her own money has been managed, Renata. That's not an accusation. It's a request." "It's an accusation," she snapped. "You've been at that hospital for 5 minutes, and suddenly you're an expert on Mom's finances? You don't know anything about what I've done for her, what I've sacrificed, while you were off living your life pretending we didn't exist." "I called every Sunday for 10 years, I said quietly, and something in the flatness of my own voice must have surprised her, because she stopped mid-sentence. "I sent a card for every birthday. Every one. Did you know that, Renata? Because I have copies of every single one I mailed, dated, and I know exactly how many of them Mom actually received, because Sophie showed me where the rest of them ended up." There was a beat of silence on the line then, but not the long kind, not yet. Just Renata catching her breath, recalibrating the way she always did in an argument, like a boxer taking half a second in the corner before coming back out swinging. "Sophie doesn't know what she's talking about," she said, too fast, the words tumbling over each other in a way that told me more than the sentence itself did. "She's 17, Claire. She found some old box of mine and decided to play detective. And now you're building some whole story out of it, and none of it is fair to me." "I'm not building a story, Renata," I said. "I'm describing a photograph. A drawer in your home office full of cards addressed in my handwriting, unopened, going back years. That's not a story. That's a picture on a phone." "Those could be anything," she said. "You don't even know when that photo was taken." "You're right," I said, and I let my voice go very calm, very even, the way I'd learned to speak to families in the worst moment of their lives, because that calm, I had discovered, unsettled people far more than raising my voice ever would. "I don't know exactly when it was taken, so why don't you tell me? How many of my cards are actually in that drawer, Renata? Ballpark. You'd know better than I would." She didn't answer that. I heard her breathing instead, quick and shallow. The sound of someone standing very still in a room, doing the math on how much I actually knew versus how much I was only guessing, and not liking either possibility. I want to tell you that I felt triumphant in that silence, that some old, wounded part of me finally got the satisfaction it had been owed for a decade. I didn't. Not exactly. What I felt was something closer to grief, standing there in my kitchen with the phone pressed to my ear. Because underneath the anger, I could hear my sister, my actual sister, the girl who used to sneak me half her dessert under the table when we were small enough to still like each other uncomplicated, genuinely frightened. And some old, stubborn part of me still didn't want that for her, even now, even after everything. "You think you're so much better than me," Renata said finally, and her voice had changed again, gone thinner, sharper, less controlled. "You always did. Quiet, patient Claire, everybody's favorite, never had to try for anything. Do you know what it was like, growing up in this family being the one who had to make noise just to get noticed? Mom baked pies with you.
Mom corrected your homework at the table every night. Do you know what she did with me? She told me to go watch television so she could have peace and quiet with her favorite. I closed my eyes for a moment, standing in my kitchen, because that sentence landed somewhere old and tender in me, a place I hadn't expected this call to reach. I had never once, in 46 years of being her sister, heard Renata describe our childhood that way. I had always assumed, the way younger siblings sometimes do, that the older one simply had more freedom, more trust, more of whatever currency parents hand out first to the child who arrived first. It had never occurred to me, not once, that she might have been keeping her own private ledger the entire time, tallying up every moment our mother chose stillness with me over noise with her, filing each one away as proof of something she never said out loud until a phone call in January, nearly 40 years later, finally cracked it loose. I didn't know you felt that way, I said quietly, and I meant it. I'm sorry, Renata. I mean that. I didn't understand growing up that it looked that way from where you were standing. For just a second, I thought something might actually shift between us in that moment. Some old wound finally spoken instead of buried. Some small crack of understanding opening where there had only ever been accusation before. But then her voice hardened again, fast, like a door slamming shut on a room someone had only meant to peek into. Don't, she said. Don't do that. Don't be gentle with me right now, Claire, like you're trying to talk me down off a ledge. I know what you're doing. You're trying to get me to feel guilty enough to back off the lawyer, and it's not going to work. I'm not trying to get you to do anything, I said. I already told you, this isn't about revenge. Everything is about revenge with you people, she snapped, and I noted, distantly, the strange slip in her language. You people. As though I had become, in the space of one phone call, something separate from her family entirely, a category rather than a sister. You show up once, in the hospital, one time, and suddenly you're rewriting 10 years like it was all some grand conspiracy. Mom is complicated, Claire. She says things she doesn't mean. She said things about you that would break your heart, things I never even told you because I didn't want to hurt you. And now you're acting like I'm the villain for managing all of that quietly, without dragging you into it every single time she had a bad day. I stood very still at that, because it was, I understood immediately, the closest thing to a real defense my sister had offered yet. Not a denial, but a reframing, an attempt to recast a decade of interception as a kind of protection I should have been grateful for instead of furious about. It was, I thought, almost clever, in the particular way that half-truths built out of genuine memory can be more convincing than outright lies. I did not doubt that my mother had, in some low moment, said something sharp about me that Renata had genuinely heard and genuinely carried. Grief does that to people. It makes them say things at their worst that aren't the truest thing about them, only the loudest. Maybe she did, I said slowly. Maybe there were days she said things about me you didn't want to repeat. I believe that's possible, Renata, I do. But that doesn't explain a folder with my name on it that she's kept hidden behind her winter coats for months, checking on it like it matters more than almost anything else she owns. It doesn't explain a note in her file from 14 months ago asking staff for help mailing letters because the phone, in her own words, wasn't safe. Whatever bad days she had, whatever things she said in anger, None of that explains the parts of her that were quietly, deliberately trying to reach me the entire time, using every method she had left once she stopped trusting the ones you controlled. There was a long pause then, not the final silence yet, but the one right before it, the sound of my sister standing somewhere in her own kitchen or office or hallway, absorbing a detail I don't think she had expected me to have. "What folder?" she said, and her voice had dropped almost to nothing. Careful now, the particular careful of someone who has just realized the ground beneath them has more cracks in it than they'd accounted for. "What are you talking about, Claire? What folder?" "You don't know?" I asked, and I let the question sit there a moment before I answered it, because I wanted her to feel, even for just a few seconds, the particular vertigo of not knowing something about our mother's private life that I apparently did. "There's a lockbox, Renata, in her closet, behind the winter coats. Inside it, there's a folder with my name written on the front in her handwriting. She checks on it. She keeps it safe. I don't know yet what's inside it, that I intend to find out. And I think, whatever it is, it's going to matter a great deal more than anything either of us says on this phone call tonight." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I actually checked to see if the call had dropped. It hadn't. "I don't know what you think you're doing," Renata finally said, her voice lower now, colder, the performance stripped out of it. "But you are going to destroy this family, chasing some fantasy where you're the victim. Mom is fragile. She doesn't need a lawyer poking through her finances right now. She needs stability, and stability is what I've given her for 10 years while you were nowhere." "I was calling," I said. "I was writing letters. I was mailing cards. I was trying every single week for 10 years. And somebody made sure none of it ever reached her. I think we both know exactly who that somebody was." I heard her breath catch, just slightly, on the other end of the line. The sound of a person realizing, in real time, that the ground she'd been standing on for a decade had just developed a crack she could no longer pretend not to see. "You have no idea what you're talking about," she said. But the conviction was gone from it now, replaced by something thinner, something closer to fear. "I think I'm starting to," I said. "And Renata, I want you to hear this clearly because I'm only going to say it once. This isn't about revenge. I don't want to destroy you. I want the truth, and I want Mom to have whatever time she has left knowing exactly who actually loves her, without anyone standing in the way of that anymore. The accounting demand isn't going away. And if what I think happened to that money actually happened, that's not something a phone call is going to fix. So I'd think very carefully before you say another word to me about whether you'd rather explain yourself to a lawyer or to Mom." She hung up on me. It was, I noted with a strange, distant kind of clarity, the exact same thing our mother had done to me exactly 1 month earlier on Christmas Eve at 6:04. The difference was that this time, I wasn't the one left standing in the wreckage of a silence I didn't understand. This time, I was the one who finally knew where every piece of that silence had gone, and I intended to make sure everyone else knew it too. That call was the beginning of what I can only describe as the unraveling. Not a single dramatic confrontation, but a slow, deliberate accumulation of pressure over the following 3 weeks. The kind of pressure that doesn't announce itself loudly but simply builds, room by room, meeting by meeting, until the structure it's aimed at has nowhere left to stand. Diane had filed the formal accounting demand through proper legal channels, which meant Renata's attorney, a brisk, overworked family lawyer named Mr. Castellano, who I got the distinct impression had not been told the full picture of what he was defending,
had 30 days to produce a complete record of every transaction made under the power of attorney since it was granted. In the meantime, Priya kept working quietly through the public and semi-public records available to her, building out the shape of Ashford Family Holdings, LLC, when it was registered 4 months after Renata received power of attorney, which was itself a detail that made Diane go very still and very focused when I told her. "That's not a coincidence," Diane said. "That's a plan." I also, on Diane's advice, requested, gently, carefully, never pushing harder than my mother could handle on any given day, that Eleanor herself review what records she could remember signing over the years. It was hard on her. I watched her face during those conversations, watched her work through the particular grief of realizing that trust she had placed in her own daughter had very possibly been abused for years. And I sat with her through it, the way I imagined she once sat with me through childhood fevers, patient, present, not rushing the pain along faster than it wanted to move. "I signed things because she told me they were routine," my mother said one afternoon, her voice small and disbelieving. "I signed because I trusted her, Claire, because she's my daughter." She looked up at me, her eyes wet. "The way I should have trusted you, all along, and didn't." "You trusted the version of me she gave you," I said gently. "That's not the same thing as not trusting me. And Mom, we have time now. We have time to fix that." She squeezed my hand, and something in her face settled, just slightly, like a person putting down a weight they'd been carrying so long they'd forgotten it was there. That moment, more than any legal filing, more than any bank statement Priya eventually pulled, is the one I hold on to when I think back on that whole strange, painful season. Because underneath all of it, the money, the lawyers, the decade of silence, what we were actually rebuilding, slowly, sentence by sentence, was simply the ability to trust each other again. By the second week of February, Renata's lawyer produced a partial accounting, and it was, even by Diane's professional, unshockable standards, damning. $94,000 over 5 years had moved from accounts tied to my mother's house sale into Ashford Family Holdings, LLC, described in the filing only as consulting and management fees. A description Priya noted, with the driest possible tone, was legally almost meaningless without invoices, hours logged, or any actual documentation of services rendered. There were no invoices. There were no hours logged. There was simply money, moving from a vulnerable, isolated 71-year-old woman's accounts into a business entity controlled entirely by the daughter managing her affairs. "This is enough to escalate," Diane told me, sitting across from me at her office table with the printed accounting spread between us like evidence at a trial, because, in a sense, that's exactly what it was becoming. "I'd like to bring in Adult Protective Services formally. Not to punish anyone unnecessarily, Claire, but because your mother deserves an independent investigation into whether this constitutes financial elder abuse under state law. And frankly, a formal state investigation carries a weight that a family conversation never will. If your sister has been counting on this staying inside the family, where she's always controlled the narrative, an outside investigator changes that completely." I thought about that word, narrative, and how perfectly it described the last 10 years of my life. Renata had never needed the truth on her side. She had only ever needed the story, told confidently and often enough, in enough rooms, to enough people, that nobody thought to ask for proof. An APS investigator wasn't interested in narrative. An investigator was interested in bank statements, dates, and signatures. That was exactly the kind of ally I needed now. Someone whose authority didn't depend on how convincingly a story was told, but on what could actually be verified as true. The investigator assigned to the case was a measured, unhurried man named Mr. Alvarez,
who had, in his own words, seen this particular shape of family before more times than I can count. He met with my mother alone first, at her request, in the small sunroom at Brookhaven, and I sat outside in the hallway for nearly an hour while she told a stranger, in her own words, finally unfiltered by anyone standing between them, exactly what the last decade had felt like from inside it. When he came out, he found me in the hallway and simply said, "Mrs. Ashford, your mother is a very clear, very credible witness to her own life. I don't think this is going to be a difficult case to substantiate." Then, after a pause, in a slightly gentler voice, he added, "She also wanted me to tell you that she's sorry it took her this long to find her way back to you. I told her that wasn't really her doing to apologize for. I think, once all this is resolved, you two are going to want to have that conversation properly, just the two of you." I held on to that all the way home. Somewhere in a hospital's fluorescent hallway on Christmas Eve, I had been terrified of what I'd find behind that curtain. Now, 2 months later, I understood that what I'd found wasn't a mother who'd stopped loving me. I'd found a mother who had never stopped, buried under a lie so patiently constructed it had taken a heart attack and a next of kin form to finally crack it open. Renata called again the week Mr. Alvarez formally opened the state investigation. And this time, there was no performance left in her voice at all, just something raw and frightened. The sound of a person watching the walls of a very carefully built house come down floor by floor. "You're going to ruin me," she said. "Do you understand that? An investigation, Claire. This could mean charges. This could mean I lose everything. You should have thought about that before you spent Mom's money and hid her mail," I said. And I meant it to come out gentler than it did, but 10 years is a long time, and some of what came up in my voice in that moment was 10 years old. "I did everything for her," Renata said, her voice cracking now, real tears audible under the words. "Do you know what it's like? Being the one everyone counts on, year after year, while you got to just disappear and still somehow be the favorite in her memory? I was there. Every single week, I was there. And it was never enough. It was never going to be enough, because she always wanted you." I sat with that for a moment, because underneath the anger and the fear in her voice, I heard something that startled me. Something almost like grief of her own, a decade of resentment that had, in its own twisted way, been feeding the very thing it was angry about. "Renata," I said slowly, "I'm not the one who kept her from wanting you too. You did that. You built a wall, and then you stood on your side of it feeling abandoned by both of us. Nobody made you do that. You could have let me back in at any point in the last 10 years. And instead, you built an LLC. She didn't have an answer for that. The call ended a few minutes later, quieter than it had begun. And I remember sitting in my kitchen afterward, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel yet. Not triumph, not really, but a kind of sad, tired clarity. The sense of watching a structure finally fall that had been rotten at its center for far longer than anyone outside it had ever known. The formal reckoning, when it finally came, didn't happen the way I'd once imagined confrontations like this happening, back before I understood how the real world actually resolves these things. There was no dramatic scene in a ballroom, no gasping crowd of onlookers. It happened in a conference room at Diane's law office on a rainy Tuesday morning in early March, almost exactly 10 years to the week since my father had died.
which felt to me like something more than coincidence, though I couldn't have told you exactly what. Present in that room, my mother, stronger now, sitting very upright in a navy blazer she'd asked Sophie to help her pick out, wanting, she told me, to look like herself again for this. Diane, Mr. Alvarez, with a folder of findings. Priya, with the full financial accounting laid out in careful, undeniable order. Renata and Mr. Castellano, her attorney, both looking considerably smaller than the versions of them I remembered from 10 years of family gatherings, where Renata had always taken up the most space in the room. And Sophie, 17 years old, sitting beside me, not beside her mother, a choice that I watched land on Renata's face like a physical blow. Mr. Alvarez opened by stating, plainly and without theater, the findings of his investigation, that over 5 years, $94,000 had moved from Eleanor Ashford's assets into an LLC controlled solely by Renata, without documentation, invoicing, or Eleanor's informed consent. That correspondence intended for Eleanor from her other daughter had been systematically intercepted over a period of at least 14 months, and likely much longer based on Eleanor's own testimony, and that this pattern met the state's legal definition of financial elder abuse and isolation of a vulnerable adult. He stated it the way you'd read a weather report, flat, factual, undeniable. And I watched my sister's face go through every stage Diane had warned me it might. First, blank denial, then a scramble toward justification, then, as the numbers kept coming, a kind of stunned, silent collapse. "I want to say something," my mother said then, and the room went quiet, because everyone there understood that whatever she said next mattered more than any spreadsheet Priya had prepared. She looked at Renata for a long moment, and I watched my sister's whole body brace for it. "I'm not going to pretend I don't understand why you did some of what you did," Eleanor said slowly, her voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "I know grief made all of us into people we didn't recognize after your father died. I know you felt like you were the one holding everything together while your sister was 4 states away. I know that, Renata, and some small part of me is always going to be grateful for the years you gave me at Brookhaven." Renata's eyes filled, and for a second I thought this might soften into something gentler than what came next. "But you took my letters," my mother continued, and her voice, though it didn't rise, hardened into something I hadn't heard from her in a decade. "You let me believe, for 10 years, that my own daughter had abandoned me, when the truth was that you had made sure she never could reach me at all. And you spent my money your father and I worked our whole lives for, without ever once being honest with me about it. You told everyone Claire left us. You said she doesn't get to come back when it's convenient. I want you to understand something, Renata, and I want you to sit with it the way I've had to sit with what I did to her for 10 years without knowing the truth. I am the one who left, not her. I let myself be convinced to leave her because it was easier than questioning the daughter standing in front of me every day. That is my failure, and I will carry it. But it was never hers. Love isn't the child who never leaves the room, Renata. It's the one who keeps knocking on a door somebody else locked." The room was completely silent. Renata was crying now, openly. The kind of crying that comes when every excuse a person has been rehearsing for weeks finally runs out of road at the exact same moment. "Mom, please," she said. "I can fix this. I can pay it back. I never meant— I know you'll pay it back, Mr. Alvarez said quietly, not unkindly, because the state is going to require it, along with a formal restitution plan. And depending on how the district attorney's office chooses to proceed, potentially more than that. This isn't really about what you meant, Mrs. Kowalski. He used her married name deliberately, I think, a small, professional way of drawing a boundary around the moment, of refusing to let it collapse back into the softer language of family. It's about what happened to a vulnerable adult under your care. Sophie, beside me, was crying quietly too, and when Renata's eyes found her daughter's face across that conference table, searching, I think, for one ally left in the room, Sophie didn't look away, but she also didn't move toward her. "I love you, Mom," Sophie said, her voice shaking but clear. "But I couldn't watch this happen to Grandma anymore. I'm sorry, I had to tell the truth." I didn't say very much in that meeting, in the end. I found I didn't need to. 10 years of a lie had been built entirely out of a story told confidently and repeatedly by one person, in a room where the other person wasn't present to contradict it. All I had needed to do, in the end, was become present again and let the truth do the rest of the work. I did say one thing, though, near the close of the meeting. Quiet, not cruel, just final. The way you close a door you've spent a decade standing outside of. I looked at my sister and I said, "You used to say I don't get to come back when it's convenient, Renata. I want you to know, this was never convenient. Not one day of the last 10 years was convenient. I came back anyway, because she's my mother, and because the truth doesn't wait for a convenient moment to surface. It just waits for someone to stop being afraid of it." She didn't have anything to say to that. Mr. Castellano gathered his papers, and the meeting moved into the practical machinery of restitution schedules and legal timelines. And somewhere in the middle of all that quiet, procedural aftermath, I looked over at my mother and found her already looking back at me, her eyes wet but steady. And she reached over and took my hand under the table, the way she used to when I was small and frightened, and needed to know, without either of us saying anything at all, that she was still there. The weeks after that meeting moved with a strange, quiet momentum, the kind that follows any collapse, not dramatic anymore, just administrative. A slow unwinding of consequences that had been 10 years in the building. Renata agreed, through her attorney, to a restitution plan that would repay the full $94,000 over the following 3 years, secured against her own home. And the district attorney's office, after reviewing Mr. Alvarez's findings, ultimately declined to pursue criminal charges in exchange for the restitution agreement and Renata's full cooperation. A decision Diane told me was fairly typical in cases where the family member repays voluntarily and there's no prior record. Though she was careful to remind me that the choice belonged entirely to prosecutors, not to us, and that we had done everything within our power simply by bringing the truth into daylight. I won't pretend the aftermath was clean, or that everyone in the family accepted the truth easily once it surfaced. Some relatives who had repeated Renata's story for a decade, "She left us, she doesn't get to come back when it's convenient," had to sit with the discomfort of having spread something untrue about me for years, without ever once checking whether it was accurate. A few reached out, awkward and apologetic, in the weeks that followed. My Aunt Barbara called and cried on the phone for almost 20 minutes, apologizing for every Thanksgiving she'd let pass without asking me directly what had actually happened. A cousin sent a long email, the kind people write when they've been carrying quiet guilt for a long time,
and finally have somewhere to put it. I forgave most of them easily, because I understood, better than most people could, how convincing a confidently told story can be when the person it's about isn't in the room to contradict it.
Renata herself, I did not forgive quickly, and I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story people expect, the tidy one, where the villain grovels and the wronged sister sweeps in with grace and everyone hugs it out over a holiday table by spring. That is not entirely what happened, and I don't think it needed to be for the story to end well. What actually happened was slower and more human than that. Renata moved out of the house that had partly funded her deception, downsized into a small apartment, started the long, humbling work of actual restitution, month by month, and began, slowly, without an audience, without the performance she'd always needed before, seeing a therapist to unpack exactly why she'd needed, for a decade, to be the only daughter our mother had left. Sophie stayed close to both her grandmother and me through all of it, the one relationship in this story that never needed repairing because it had never been broken in the first place, just quietly, bravely protected by a teenager who chose honesty over comfort at real personal cost. She and Renata are rebuilding something too, slower, more complicated, the particular repair work of a daughter who loves her mother and also, rightly, could not stay silent while that mother caused harm. I don't know exactly what that relationship will look like in 5 years. I know Sophie has my number saved under a name that isn't a secret anymore, and she calls me sometimes just to talk, and that alone tells me something has healed that I once thought might never have the chance to. As for my mother and me, we built it back slowly, the way you rebuild anything that took real damage. Sunday calls again, actual ones this time, ones that connect. I drive out to Brookhaven most weekends now, and some Sundays she comes to my house instead, sitting at my kitchen table the way she used to when I was young, correcting nothing anymore, just watching me cook, telling me stories about my father I'd never heard, filling in, slowly, 10 years of a life I'd been locked out of. She keeps a photograph of the two of us, taken the week after that hospital stay, on the little corkboard in her room at Brookhaven, right in the center, where I understand now my cards had never once been allowed to hang. Last month, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, my mother told me something I've thought about every day since. We were sitting on her small balcony, the early spring air still sharp enough to need blankets over our knees, and she said, without any particular lead-up, "I want you to know why I wrote your name down in September, Claire. I need you to understand I hadn't heard your voice properly in years by then. I didn't even know, some days, if you were still the same person I remembered. But somewhere underneath everything I'd been told, I still knew, in the part of me nobody could reach, that if something happened to me, if it really mattered, you were the one I trusted to come." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just held her hand, the way I had that first night in the hospital, and let the weight of that sentence settle into me properly. 10 years of silence, and underneath every bit of it, some small, stubborn, unshakable part of my mother had never once actually let me go. She had simply been waiting, patiently, and then desperately, and finally successfully, for the wall between us to come down long enough for that truth to reach the surface. I think about that phone call often now. 6:04 on Christmas Eve, the hang-up that I believed for 3 whole hours was the final word in a story that had already ended long before that. I think about how close I came to simply accepting it as the last chapter, the way I'd accepted so many silences before it. And I think about what it means that the very same night, 3 hours later, a nurse's voice on the phone quietly rewrote everything I thought I understood about the last decade of my life. If there is one thing I would want you to take from all of this, it's that the story someone tells confidently and often enough is not the same thing as the truth.
no matter how completely it seems to have settled into the shape of fact around you. For 10 years, I believed a version of my own life that had been handed to me by someone else's convenience, someone else's fear, someone else's need to be the only daughter left standing. I let that story cost me a decade with my mother, because I never thought to question whether the silence I was living inside of had actually been built by the person I blamed for it. I don't say that to frighten you, but I do say it, gently, as an invitation. If there is a silence in your own life that has never quite made sense to you, a relationship gone quiet in a way that never fully added up, a version of events that everyone around you seems to accept a little too easily, I would ask you to consider, the way I eventually had to, whether the story you've been told is actually the truth or simply the version that was most convenient for someone else to tell. Sometimes the people we've grieved as lost to us were never actually the ones who left. Sometimes they were only ever waiting, quietly, for someone brave enough to finally ask the right question. My mother is 72 now. Her heart is steady, her mind is sharp, and most Sundays, if you drove past my house around noon, you'd find her at my kitchen table, telling stories, watching me cook, correcting nothing, simply present the way I'd once believed, for 10 long years, she never wanted to be again. Have you ever discovered that a silence in your own family wasn't what it seemed? That someone you loved never actually left you, but was kept from you instead? I would love to hear your story in the comments below, whatever shape it took, because I think there are more of us carrying versions of this than any of us realize. And if this story meant something to you tonight, I'd be grateful if you'd hit like and subscribe, so more stories like this one can find the people who need them, the way I hope this one found you.